question: how far is the current system from best practices? Does the current system achieve the technical and vocational education and training aspirations of the Egyptian manufacturing companies? The moderator is Mr. Alaa Hashim, Chairman Transidium and the treasurer of the ECES, and Dr. Rama Saeed will give the presentation. She works as a senior economist in the center. I would like to close the doors, please. We will work, or we will cover the two sessions in one go, and we should finish at 3 sharp to have our own lunch. So, Dr. Rama will give a presentation, and then Dr. Abla will comment. Later on, I would like to invite the panelists of session 2 and 3. Good afternoon, everyone. Before delving deep into my presentation, I would like to say that the team is very happy with the comments that was raised in session 1. All the stakeholders of TAVET in Egypt were engaged in order to take stock of the situation and to build on the current situation rather than reinventing the wheel. As Dr. Abla said, the efforts were listed in a detailed manner, but today in these presentations we are just focusing on the highlights. Of course, we have our own focus. That's why we are trying to bridge the information gap that is there. And by the end of today's session, we want to design a road map to transform TAVET in a very sustainable manner. The starting point for any reform starts with assessment. We need to answer a set of questions. Does the system realize the objectives? Can we provide the market with skilled labor now and in the future? Second, how far is the current system from best practices? In this presentation, we try to answer these two questions. At the outset, I would like to give you a background on the system. As you all know, the technical education is given in the middle school, in secondary schools, and at the university level. There are also some other systems like technology complex and applied technology schools. In Egypt, we have more than 2,000 schools, 40% of the total number of schools, 99% of these schools are public, 1% are affiliated with the private sector, 50% of the graduates of TAVET education comes from industrial technical schools, and 62% are males. As for vocational training, we don't have accurate data regarding training centers. We have different numbers from the Ministry of Manpower or from CAPMAS or from the Ministry of Education. But at the end of the day, كفالة الإنتاجية system or training centers are responsible for that. We have a number of governing frameworks. First, the cultural framework, and here I'm referring to the perception people have when it comes to workers. We also have a strategic framework and then an organizational framework, and this organizational framework covers stakeholders. We have a legislative framework that is concerned with the controls of this system, and of course this is binding. We have also an information framework and we have a financing framework. In Egypt, workers are viewed in a very negative light. We have many strategies. So we might have a strategy drafted by the Ministry of Education, another strategy by the Ministry of Manpower, and sometimes there is no kind of coordination whatsoever. There is a strategic framework, but the question to be posed, to what extent is that framework binding to all the stakeholders in TEVIT in Egypt? Up to this present day, technical education is something and vocational training is another story. People are working on islands while they are very interrelated. One is initial and the other is continuous professional development. That's why we usually combine technical education and vocational training as one thing or interrelated things. As for the organizational thing, we have the government, which is the main stakeholder. The private sector has a very limited role, and the donors also play a very supportive role. We have many pieces of legislations like the law of education, the law of labor, in addition to many ministerial decrees, and bylaws. We also have an information framework which is not up to the standards or the expectations. We have a government financing framework that is central. We have a budget for public education and for technical education. Now the questions: does this system achieve the objectives and aspirations? Based on the survey we designed and its main pillars, we can say that 74% have labor related challenges. 89% provide on the job training. 74% do not have a preference for the kind of graduates they want. 64% do not have a preference for people with middle certificate. 80% do not cooperate with training centers or educational institutions, and some of them are not even willing. So, bottom line, the current system does not fulfill the needs of the industry and will not be able to cover the future needs. How far is Egypt from best practices? Dr. Abla, in the opening session, said that we chose Germany, Singapore, and Finland to compare our system with these systems. Each, of course, experience is individual, and there is no silver bullet or there is no one model answer, but we can build on some of the lessons learned. You need to care for three things: good governance, diversity and sustainability of financing, integrated system of the job market, and quality control and assurance. Each country has its own edge. So Germany adopts a very decentralized system because coordination is key between the federal government and the governorate's administration, and the private sector is very engaged when it comes to planning or execution and implementation. And they also finance. In Finland, they have one law for technical education and vocational training covering all related aspects. The government financing is conditional upon the performance. It's not a lump sum. 50% is initial and then 35% after achieving a certain result, and then the rest is given if they get a job. And they have one single authority to coordinate. In Singapore, they have a very good planning system. Financing is based on strategic priorities with an integrated database. Where is Egypt? If we compare Egypt to these countries, then we are using color coding. So if Egypt is close to the best practices, then we would use green. If some of the aspects are similar, we would use yellow. If Egypt is far, far from the best practices, then we would use red. So best practices are in green in this presentation. When it comes to good governance, planning should be participatory, representing unions, syndicates, and that should be part and parcel of the socio-economic development, and it should be evidence-based. Here we have yellow and red. It's not evidence-based, and coordination is not really strong enough. The state has its own rules. It sets the lines, it gives permissions in line with technical standards and quality standards. The state provides educational services within unified controls. When it comes to the private sector's role, it's engaged in planning, curricula design, standards, assessment and testing, financing, and also providing educational and training services. Of course, universities and research institutes have a role to play when it comes to studying the new emerging trends in economy and the impact of these trends. In Egypt, we have many authorities. We don't have a focal point, or we don't have an authority to coordinate. There is a very limited role for the private sector to play. Sometimes they are relatively engaged in policy setting and the curricula design. Also, there is no link between academia and the industry. In the green column, we have solid controls that are published beforehand for self-assessment, for external auditing, and these evaluations should be public. We don't have this in Egypt, but we have some quantitative indicators, but we do not evaluate institutions in the same manner. Furthermore, yes, we are far from best practices, and we have some organizational challenges. Some institutions would be established and then cancelled without any study. So, for example, we cancelled ITC. Also, there are no accreditation institutions. Yes, some models are successful, but it's not mainstreamed. And here I want to refer to local partnerships and sectorial partnerships. Again, when it comes to the legislative framework, we should have one system or different sets of legislations that complement one another. Here in Egypt, we have many legislations that do not cover all the stakeholders. Some elements are not even covered by legislations, like the National Framework for Qualification and practice permits for graduates of technical education. We have the educational law, which was issued in 1981. Some codes are not even enforced on the ground. Some articles of the labor law are not enforced, and we have a reference to the Supreme Council for Human Resources, which is not there on the ground. Now moving to the sustainability of financing, it should be between both the government and the private sector, conditional upon the approval of certain programs, and SMEs and small workshops should be exempt from covering the expenses resources. Training resources should be managed by an independent authority in a very flexible manner. Schools should be given some autonomy to manage the training process. Here, financing is not conditional upon the performance, and the Ministry of Manpower manages that, and expenses are assigned in a very centralized manner. Schools cannot manage their own resources. We have other challenges in this regard. The budget of technical education and vocational training is not separate from public education in Egypt. The controls are not in line with the nature of the process, or not in line with revenue generating units. As for the dynamic of the system, we should have one entity responsible for quality control and quality assurance in a very transparent manner to make sure that the minimum standards are ensured. We should engage the private sector, and we should have qualifications and standards. We should have a system for testing and the qualification for public and private schools. Testing should be done in real work, in real environment that simulates the work environment later. In Egypt, any school that is accredited will be accredited by NACA. We don't have a separate entity for TEVET certification, which is different from public education. And certification is not even binding. Admission in TEVET is score based, with no regard to students' abilities, aptitude, or preference. When it comes to education and training, that should be a very flexible system to improve the skill set of students. We should have M&E mechanisms to ensure quality. We should develop the system in line with the socioeconomic variables. Last, an integrated information system on the labor market. We should assess the needs of education and the labor skills through an entity. Planners or policymakers should benefit from these estimations or these projections, and data should be available for all stakeholders in TEVET.
Data collection depends on surveys on businesses, on service providers, and the technology advancements. In Egypt, we do not have any estimates on needs with respect to workers and laborers, and the data sources are so many and diverse, and we have lack of monitoring and evaluation for the performance of the sectors. There are other challenges. There were more than one trial to build an information system for the labor market. The latest were through Imtidad, but they were not completed, including the not identification of the management entity that regulates the data available. So there is a gap between the ultimate goal and the current situation, and thus we lack the ability to face the challenges, and we lose so many opportunities. And thank you so much. While preparing this session, I got a report on OECD on Germany. And I want to tell you some figures. Germany's economy is among the top 5 economies with respect to GDP, innovation, industrial productivity. It's always excelling. 50% of those educated in Germany are enrolled in the pre-vocational or vocational. The design of the system is based on integration between education and employment so that people are qualified to the labor market right away. Can you imagine the figure of the people who are conducting higher studies? Could you imagine the percentage? 3%. 3%. NBA people are more in Egypt than in Germany.
الموقع المتوسط العام بتاع الاو اي سي دي اللي هي منظمه التعاون الدولي والتنميه اللي هم اقوى اقتصادات في العالم. بس نقطه كده بس ناخد نفس كده بايه ونفكر نفس
And
النفس.
that's why you have to
هو
consider
بيفكر
this.
بس ويبدو ان الاقتصاد الالماني
And
ان
it
هو
seems that
امام
the German economy is good, of course.
زي بالفعل. فيمكن ده بس يدفعنا ان احنا
So
نقول
this might
اعتقد
push
مش
us
محتاج
to
تحسين، هو
think
اعتقد
about
ان
it's not about improvement,
محتاجين
it's about
عصب الاقتصاد بتاع اي دوله اللي هو
thinking
التعليم
about the
والتعليم والرقابه
core
والتعليم
of
والصناعه
how to improve the economy of the
وتوسيع الاقتصاد
state.
اللي هي حاجه
It
اسمها
has to do with linking the education with the employment.
مش ازاي نحسن، احنا محتاجين
Not to think about improvement, but to think about
في اعتقد لازم نتحرر تماما
or
من
to
اطار
liberate
الحالي
ourselves
الاقتصادي
from
اللي
the
هو الاو
current
اي سي دي
framework and think about a new framework
ونتكلم عقليا
through
عن
which we
فكره
can
اللي
innovate
هو
to achieve the shift
التطبيق
that
اللي
we
انا
want.
بتكلم
And the
عليه اللي هي
report I
الدراسه
mentioned
كيف ترتقي
includes a study
بالكفاءه
that
دي
links
وكفاءه المنظومه دي
the
بالتنميه
competency of
والتنميه
this system
وكفاءه
to
المنظومه دي
the
على
employment
مستوى
system.
على ايه؟ على نبص على
It
مستويات
tells you,
تكلفه
allow us to
الانفاق
think
الاقتصادي
about the
على مستوى دول الاو اي
employment
سي دي اخرى.
in comparison
بنعمل
with
نظام
the
استثماري
OECD
حديث
countries
عن النظام اللي هو دول اخرى
to
بتعملها
show how
بنظام
competent the
نظام
system
نظام
is.
يعني مش عارفين بتاع الكلام ده هيقفل بس لو الشاي والسؤال بس حاجه خلينا ننتقل
So I've just mentioned this so that you can think more about it and study it. And Dr. Amla as well is going to tackle an experience of another country. The benchmark is the work done, that the factories are accepting what's done. But as long as the supply is there, but the result is not there, so there is something wrong about the system. Ala has talked about Germany. I'm going to talk about Singapore. And I went to Singapore and I took these pictures myself. In 1 minute, I'm going to show you these pictures. This is the technical education university or faculty in Singapore. It's like the engineering faculty in the past. So to make the laborers and the technicians proud of what they are doing, of course, you have to provide them with the appropriate environment. This is an important aspect. This is one of the models they studied of an aeroplane. They were studying the hosting, and it's a real plane with real scales. It's called Institute of Technical Education in Singapore. Here they study IT, visual effects, and so on. These are engineering industries. Look how beautiful is the place and how clean is it. These are things that have to do with electronic manufacturing and engineering industries. These are the devices, the equipment. They train them on maintaining the aeroplanes, maintenance of aeroplanes. Military aircrafts and ITE headquarters. This is the name of the institute. These are the students that are learning about the engine of the plane or the aircraft, electronic manufacturing. Here they learn about engineering drawings and the 3D dimensions. And here is the aeroplane. Look how happy they are. These are the aeroplanes. I was surprised about, I was impressed by the aeroplane workshops. It's not one aeroplane, there are so many. So this is the quality. This is how I can improve the system. In the south of Korea, they have a system. There was a stigma that linked to the technical workers, technical education workers, and then they started to to motivate the students, and in the Singapore Institute, there are so many advantages. Number one, they cooperate in complete with the private sector. All the training materials come from the private sector. The private sector develops the curricula. The private sector instructors come to educate the students, and it's dynamic process there. The second thing, they do not have more graduates than what's needed. This is important thing, so that the workers are not cheap. If they need 150, so they train 150, 160 maximum. But they do not train, for example, 1,000, so that when they go to the labor market, they have high salaries. The third thing, the funds are provided by the government with generosity, so the students perform with high quality. The system is very promising, and Dr. Tarek Shauki went and visited them, and this is a very good experience. So we can take the blueprints of this experience and implement it. But as long as we are saying that the technicians and workers are important, and then we find out that the highest scores are for the engineers and doctors, and those who are enrolled technical education are with the least scores. So of course, they're not going to join the technical education. We have a crisis with nurses. So how we can do this? How we can face this? If we increase the score of the nurses, so of course that there will be different types enrolled to the system. And the stigma towards the workers and the technicians is the responsibility of the state and not of the community. Thank you, Dr. Abla.